There is a silent pattern operating inside many intelligent minds, a pattern so subtle that it rarely feels like sabotage. It feels like logic. It feels like caution. It feels like preparation. Yet, over time, it quietly dismantles progress, weakens decisions, and convinces capable individuals that they are not ready yet. The tragedy is not that people fail. The tragedy is that many never allow themselves to move far enough to discover what they could have become. Self-sabotage does not begin with dramatic mistakes. It begins with micro-hesitations that appear reasonable. I will start when I know more. I will act when I feel confident. I will move forward once everything is perfectly clear. These statements sound rational, even intelligent, yet they hide a dangerous assumption that certainty must come before action. In reality, certainty is produced by action, not the other way around. Waiting for confidence before beginning is like waiting for strength before lifting the weight. The mechanism never activates. The first technique that breaks the cycle of self-sabotage is something I call structured initiation. Most people attempt to change their behavior by trying to change their emotions first. They believe motivation must arrive before movement. That belief traps them. Emotions are unstable variables. They fluctuate according to sleep, stress, environment, and countless invisible factors. If action depends on emotion, consistency becomes impossible. Structured initiation reverses the equation. Action begins regardless of emotional readiness, but it begins in a precisely defined, intentionally small format. The human brain resists large, undefined efforts, not small, precise ones. When the task is vague, improve my life, start the project, be more disciplined, the mind detects uncertainty and produces avoidance. However, when the instruction becomes concrete, work on this for 12 minutes, write the first paragraph, solve one step, resistance drops dramatically. This is not motivational rhetoric. It is neurological efficiency. The brain prefers finite operations. Structured initiation works because it transforms intimidating ambitions into executable signals. Many people misunderstand discipline as intensity. They imagine discipline as heroic effort, as long, exhausting sessions of productivity. That misunderstanding leads to repeated failure because intensity cannot be sustained daily. Precision can. When initiation is structured, starting becomes automatic. And once the first movement occurs, psychological inertia begins to assist rather than resist. Motion generates clarity. Clarity generates confidence. Confidence then appears as if it were the cause, when in fact it was the consequence. Observe carefully. The greatest damage caused by self-sabotage is not lost opportunities. It is the erosion of self-trust. Each time a person promises themselves they will begin tomorrow and does not begin, an invisible contract is weakened. Over months and years, the individual stops believing their own intentions. This internal distrust produces hesitation in every domain: professional, creative, even relational. Structured initiation repairs that contract because it replaces grand promises with small, undeniable completions. Each completion becomes evidence. I start when I say I start. That evidence accumulates quietly, but its psychological impact is immense. If this insight is resonating with you, pause for a moment later today and test it deliberately. Choose something you have postponed, something you have mentally negotiated with for weeks or months, and reduce the entry point to something almost absurdly small, not symbolic, executable. Then begin exactly at the time you decided, not when you feel ready. And when you notice that familiar resistance trying to negotiate, observe it as a predictable system response rather than a personal weakness. Systems can be reprogrammed. Identities do not need to be attacked. There is another important detail. Structured initiation must be scheduled, not improvised. Improvisation leaves room for emotional bargaining, and emotional bargaining is the favorite language of self-sabotage. When the moment of action is pre-decided, the mind has less opportunity to invent excuses. Precision removes negotiation. Negotiation is where delay lives. At some point, you may notice something surprising. Once you begin in this structured manner, continuing often becomes easier than stopping. This is not accidental. The brain is designed to maintain cognitive continuity. Once engaged, it prefers to complete rather than restart later. That is why beginning is disproportionately powerful compared to planning. Planning feels productive, but beginning changes the system state. Self-sabotage loses strength the moment execution becomes habitual. Before moving further, take a second to reflect honestly. How many goals in your life have been delayed not because they were impossible, but because the starting point was never clearly defined? That question alone reveals how much potential is locked behind hesitation, disguised as strategy. If you find yourself recognizing this pattern, write somewhere, even privately, a simple commitment. I begin before I feel ready. This sentence is not motivational decoration. It is a cognitive instruction that shifts how decisions are executed. Now, while structured initiation breaks the first layer of the cycle, it does not completely eliminate self-sabotage. There is a second mechanism operating underneath: identity friction. Many individuals unconsciously maintain internal definitions of who they are allowed to become. When behavior begins to exceed that definition, subtle resistance appears. It may take the form of procrastination, sudden distraction, unnecessary perfectionism, or the quiet thought, "This is probably not for someone like me." The conscious mind interprets this as doubt. The deeper system interprets it as protection of a familiar identity. This is why people sometimes sabotage progress precisely when they are closest to advancing. Growth creates psychological instability because it requires abandoning an older self-description. And the mind, prioritizing predictability, often prefers a known limitation over an unknown expansion. Breaking this layer requires the second technique, which we will explore next: identity recalibration through evidence accumulation. A method that systematically replaces internal definitions using repeated behavioral proof rather than affirmations alone. As you continue listening, notice something subtle. The moment you understand the mechanics of self-sabotage, it stops feeling mysterious. It becomes mechanical, predictable, almost mathematical. And anything that is mechanical can be redesigned. That realization alone removes a large portion of the emotional weight many people carry when they believe their lack of progress is a character flaw rather than a system configuration. If this perspective is shifting the way you see your own patterns, share in the comments one small action you are willing to start within the next 24 hours. Not a grand transformation, just a precise beginning. Writing it publicly often increases follow-through because the mind treats declared intentions differently from silent wishes. And if you want to keep exploring how logic, behavior, and human psychology intersect to produce real change, make sure you stay connected here, because what comes next may completely alter how you understand motivation itself. Identity recalibration, through evidence accumulation, begins with a simple but often uncomfortable realization. Most people are not limited by their abilities, but by the internal narrative that defines what they believe is consistent with who they are. When behavior threatens to exceed that narrative, subtle internal resistance appears. Not dramatic resistance, not conscious refusal, something quieter. A delay, a distraction, a sudden urge to perfect what is already sufficient. These reactions are frequently misinterpreted as lack of discipline, when in reality they are the mind attempting to maintain identity stability. The human system values coherence. It prefers actions that match the story it tells about itself. If someone has silently accepted the idea, "I am not someone who finishes big projects," then every time progress approaches completion, tension appears. That tension does not come from incapacity. It comes from inconsistency between action and identity. To remove the sabotage, the identity itself must be recalibrated, and identity does not change through slogans or motivational repetition. It changes through accumulated behavioral proof. Evidence accumulation works because the brain updates internal definitions based on repeated observable outcomes. When a person consistently performs an action, even at a modest scale, the mind gradually rewrites the internal description. I am someone who begins, then I am someone who continues, and eventually I am someone who completes. Each stage is built not through intention, but through recorded experience. This is why sporadic, intense effort rarely produces lasting transformation. The evidence is inconsistent, so the identity remains unstable. Consistency, even when small, becomes far more persuasive to the subconscious than occasional bursts of performance. There is a powerful implication hidden here. The fastest way to become someone new is not to attempt radical reinvention, but to produce undeniable daily proof that contradicts the old narrative. When the mind repeatedly witnesses behavior that no longer matches the previous identity, resistance weakens. The system begins to align automatically with the new pattern because maintaining the old description becomes cognitively inefficient. The mind prefers accuracy. When evidence changes, identity follows. Many individuals unknowingly sabotage themselves at this exact stage because they wait for identity confidence before behaving differently. They think, once I truly believe I am capable, then I will act. But identity confidence is not the prerequisite, it is the result. Acting before belief feels uncomfortable precisely because the internal definition has not yet updated. That discomfort is not a signal to stop, it is a signal that the recalibration process has begun. Consider the strategic value of designing actions that generate visible proof quickly. Not massive proof and visible proof, completion of a defined segment, delivery of a promised output, adherence to a scheduled commitment. Each visible result becomes a data point that the brain records. Over weeks, these data points form a new internal conclusion. I do what I say I will do. Once this conclusion stabilizes, many forms of procrastination dissolve naturally, not because motivation increased, but because the identity that once resisted action no longer exists in the same form. Another critical aspect of evidence accumulation is public accountability. When an intention is shared, even with a small circle, the behavioral system often increases consistency because social expectation adds structural pressure. The goal is not external validation. The goal is reinforcement of follow-through mechanisms. Declared commitments create psychological weight that silent intentions rarely achieve. This is why many successful individuals deliberately announce timelines or deliverables before they feel fully prepared. They are not seeking approval. They are engineering inevitability. Pause for a moment and examine your own patterns. In which areas of your life do you still operate under an outdated identity description? Perhaps you still internally label yourself as someone who struggles with consistency, even though you have already demonstrated moments of discipline. Perhaps you continue to believe, I am not someone who speaks confidently, despite occasions where you communicated clearly when it mattered. These outdated definitions persist only because the evidence has not yet been accumulated consistently enough to override them. The solution is not to argue with the belief. The solution is to outproduce it. From this point forward, treat every small completion as strategic identity construction. Not trivial tasks, but deliberate acts of follow-through. When you execute what you planned, acknowledge it consciously, not as celebration but as registration. The brain must notice the evidence in order to update its internal model. Ignored progress does not reprogram identity, recognized progress does. If you are noticing how often self-sabotage has been less about incapacity and more about misaligned internal definitions, write somewhere visible a simple operational principle. I build identity through repeated proof. This sentence functions as a structural reminder that transformation is not a dramatic event. It is a statistical process. Enough consistent evidence inevitably shifts self-perception. There is also a subtle psychological turning point that occurs once identity recalibration begins to take effect. Decisions become faster, internal negotiations become shorter, energy previously spent on convincing yourself to act becomes available for the action itself. Many people interpret this stage as finally becoming motivated, but what truly happened was that the internal resistance architecture was dismantled by accumulated evidence. Motivation did not arrive from nowhere. Friction was removed. As you reflect on these mechanisms, choose one domain where you are ready to deliberately construct a new identity through proof, not ambition, not intention, proof. Decide what small action, repeated daily, would generate undeniable evidence within 30 days. And if you feel comfortable, write that commitment publicly. Even a brief declaration such as, "I show up daily," creates a psychological contract that strengthens execution. And if you want to continue sharpening this ability to design behavioral systems that eliminate hidden self-sabotage, stay connected, because the final segment will integrate these two techniques into a unified operating model capable of producing sustained momentum rather than temporary bursts of change. When structured initiation and identity recalibration operate together, something unusual begins to happen. Progress stops feeling like a battle and starts functioning like a system. Most people spend years trying to force themselves to change, relying on emotional surges that inevitably fade. But once action is simplified at the point of entry and identity is slowly rebuilt through evidence, consistency stops depending on how you feel in the morning. It becomes an operational standard, almost automatic. There is a misconception that discipline is about becoming harder on yourself. In reality, sustainable discipline is the result of reducing internal friction. The individual who appears extremely disciplined is often not exerting extraordinary willpower every day. They are operating inside structures that make the desired action easier than avoidance. Structured initiation lowers the barrier to starting. Evidence accumulation lowers the psychological resistance to continuing. Together, they create an environment where forward movement becomes the default behavior. Consider what typically happens in the cycle of self-sabotage. A person sets a large goal, delays starting because the task feels overwhelming, then eventually attempts a burst of intense effort to compensate for the delay. The intensity quickly becomes exhausting, consistency collapses, and the individual concludes that they lack discipline. This interpretation is incorrect. The failure did not come from lack of discipline, it came from poor system design. The entry point was too large, the expectations too volatile, and the identity not yet aligned with the required behavior. When the system is redesigned, the psychological experience changes dramatically. Starting no longer requires negotiation because the task is clearly defined and limited in scope. Continuing becomes easier because each repetition reinforces the identity of someone who follows through. Over time, the need for constant self-encouragement decreases. The process carries itself forward, much like a well-calibrated machine that continues operating once properly configured. There is also a strategic advantage in understanding that momentum is not emotional, it is statistical. Each repetition increases the probability of the next repetition. This is why even a brief interruption in consistent behavior can feel disproportionately difficult to recover from. The statistical chain was broken. Conversely, maintaining continuity, even at a small scale, preserves the chain and keeps resistance low. The objective is not to perform at maximum intensity every day, but to avoid unnecessary 0 days that reset the system. At some point, you may notice a shift in how you interpret difficulty. Instead of asking, "Do I feel motivated enough today?" you begin asking, "What is the smallest executable step that maintains continuity?" This question is transformative because it removes emotion from the decision architecture. Execution becomes procedural rather than dramatic. Over months, this procedural mindset quietly produces results that appear extraordinary to those still relying on unpredictable bursts of inspiration. There is an additional layer that many overlook. Self-respect grows not from thinking positively about yourself, but from repeatedly witnessing your own reliability. When you consistently do what you planned, even when conditions are imperfect, a subtle confidence forms. It is not loud, not theatrical, but deeply stable. You no longer need constant reassurance because your own behavior has become proof. This stability dramatically reduces the urge to sabotage progress, since there is no longer an internal narrative suggesting that failure is inevitable. Take a moment to consider where your greatest delays currently live. Not the goals you openly abandoned, but the ones you still claim you will start soon. Those are the locations where the cycle is still active. Choose one of them and redesign the starting point so precisely that avoidance becomes irrational. Then decide how you will generate repeated visible proof over the next weeks. This is not about transforming your entire life in a single decision. It is about installing a mechanism that continues operating long after the initial enthusiasm disappears. If this reflection is prompting you to reconsider how you approach your own goals, write somewhere, even privately, the phrase, "Consistency is engineered." Let it serve as a reminder that progress is not reserved for the exceptionally motivated. It is accessible to anyone willing to design their actions intelligently. And if these ideas are helping you see your own patterns with greater clarity, consider staying connected to this space and sharing this perspective with someone who might also be trapped in the silent cycle of postponement. Often the most powerful changes begin not with dramatic inspiration, but with the quiet decision to begin differently today. There comes a moment when understanding must convert into decision, not a dramatic declaration, not a sudden transformation visible to everyone around you, but a quiet internal shift where you stop negotiating with the patterns that have been quietly limiting you. Self-sabotage survives on delay. It survives on the belief that change will begin later, when conditions improve, when confidence rises, when clarity becomes perfect. Yet every meaningful transformation ever recorded began under imperfect conditions, carried forward by individuals who understood that movement creates the clarity they were waiting for. The two techniques you have just explored are not abstract theories, they are operational tools. Structured initiation removes the illusion that you must feel ready before beginning. Identity recalibration, through evidence accumulation, removes the illusion that you must believe in yourself before acting differently. When both illusions disappear, something powerful emerges: behavioral freedom. You are no longer trapped by emotional timing or outdated self-descriptions. You become capable of acting according to design rather than mood. Many people spend years attempting to eliminate self-sabotage by attacking themselves internally, labeling their hesitation as weakness or lack of discipline. That approach rarely works because it targets the person instead of the mechanism. Once you recognize that self-sabotage is simply the predictable output of systems built around vague starting points and unstable identity definitions, the problem stops feeling personal. It becomes solvable. Systems can be redesigned. Inputs can be adjusted. Repetition can reprogram outcomes. Imagine the cumulative effect of beginning consistently, even when enthusiasm is absent. Imagine the psychological stability created when your internal narrative slowly shifts from "I often delay" to "I execute when scheduled." That shift does not produce temporary excitement. It produces long-term reliability. And reliability is the foundation of every significant achievement, whether intellectual, creative, or professional. Talent without reliability rarely changes anything. Reliability, even with modest talent, often reshapes entire trajectories. There is also a deeper implication worth considering. Every time you act despite hesitation, you send a quiet signal to your own mind. Hesitation is not authority. Over time, that signal becomes a principle. You begin to notice that resistance still appears. It always will, but it no longer dictates your behavior. It becomes background noise rather than command. This is the moment when the cycle of self-sabotage truly begins to fracture, not because resistance vanished, but because obedience to resistance ended. As you move forward, avoid the temptation to apply these techniques only when motivation is high. Their real value appears on ordinary days, the days when nothing feels particularly inspiring and progress seems slow. Those are the days when structured initiation protects continuity and evidence accumulation protects identity. Extraordinary results rarely emerge from extraordinary days alone. They are built from the quiet discipline of ordinary ones. Take a moment now to identify a single action you will execute within the next 24 hours using these principles. Not a symbolic intention, not a vague promise, a defined step with a defined starting time. When you complete it, recognize what just happened. You did not merely perform a task, you strengthened a system that will make the next action easier. That is how cycles change, not through intensity, but through repeated structural advantage. If this perspective has helped you see self-sabotage not as a personal flaw, but as a solvable design problem, share a simple reflection below. I act before certainty. Writing it reinforces the decision internally. And if you want to continue refining the mental frameworks that transform hesitation into consistent forward movement, remain connected here, because the next insights you encounter may not only change how you work, they may change how you define what you are capable of becoming.